Okay, so hello and welcome to everybody. And thank you very much for joining us today as part of the Pearson webinar series on memorable teaching moments. So today I'm very excited to be facilitating this conversation with Professor Neil Martin. Today's session is called Practical Ideas for Introducing New or Controversial Research into the Introductory Psychology Programme. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Emma Gadsden and I'm the Product Manager for Psychology at Pearson. And I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce Neil. So Neil Martin is an honorary professor of psychology at Regent's University London, a life fellow of the RSA, a consultant, and most excitingly for me, an author of around 13 books and over 100 papers on psychology and related subjects. And Neil's CV is very impressive. He was the head of the Department of Psychology at Regent's. He has established a research lab in human olfaction at Middlesex University, and was associate editor of the Psychologist and Teaching of Psychology, and is an associate member of the Recreational Fear Lab in Aarhus University in Denmark. And we've worked together on the 7th edition of Psychology for Pearson, which launched around a year ago. So I'm very excited that Neil can join us today. And just before we start, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and then I will pass you over. So as many people may be joining from all around the world, from home and public places, to avoid any background noise, we've put everybody on mute, but that doesn't mean we don't want you to contribute. So please do use the chat box to type any questions as we go through, or if you want to ask a question directly, if you raise your hand, we can unmute you so that you can ask Neil questions directly. A huge thank you to those who have pre-submitted questions. We tried to incorporate as many of these into the agenda as we can, but if anything isn't answered, do just chime in and we'll see what we can do as we go through. The slides that Neil's going to share with us today, as well as the recording of today's session, will be shared in around a week's time. So keep an eye on your inboxes as that'll be coming through by email. And if you're interested in getting a sample copy or a demonstration of Neil's introductory psychology textbook, we'll be in touch after this session as well, and we would love to help you with that. So that's all from me now, and I'm going to pass over to Neil so that we can get started. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. Hello, everybody. Well, I mean, he sounds marvelous. Whoever Emma was talking about, he sounds an absolute joy and a thrill. But seriously, thank you very much indeed for joining us here today. I'm just going to get my presentation up, so bear with me for a second. So I'm just going to share this with you, and you should be able to see on screen at the moment.
Yeah, that's showing nicely.
Yeah, lovely. Me at the top, and then the first slide. Obviously, let's get the shameless promotion out of the way first, which is a copy of the 7th edition of Psychology, the book I do for Pearson, which came out in June last year. And when Emma asked me to do a little something for everybody, I thought about what we could do in terms of the book, and also teaching and introductory psychology and so on. And I think the challenge we have, and it's quite a nice challenge in introductory psychology, is making psychology interesting for students. That's normally a given, because when they join psychology in the first year, they're quite excited about psychology. They may not understand fully what psychology is as a science, but they're still pretty enthusiastic about it. And then the other challenge is making psychology interesting, but at the same time not sacrificing depth and accuracy and understanding and so on. So I thought, well, what if we consider some practical ideas for introducing new and controversial research in psychology into the introductory psychology program? And by controversial, I don't necessarily mean in a bad way. I sometimes mean in a good way. And I'm thinking specifically of replication and replicability, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. So as Emma was saying, the session is sort of interactive, so if you have any questions, put them into chat. Emma's doing the exceptional moderating today. I don't see anything, so if you say, I dislike that man's tie, don't worry, I won't get to see it, so I don't mind. It's quite a nice tie. But Emma will, and then she'll give me tie advice after the presentation. Some of the slides have quite a bit of text on, and I'm not going to go through those slides in detail because they're designed for you to have a look at later. So all this presentation will be available later because some of the slides have detailed sort of practical seminar ideas in them. So if you'd like to have a read of those in a bit more detail, you can do that a bit later. Okay, when I used to give the open day presents at Regents, we had those sort of inchoate students coming in, very enthusiastic, but not that knowledgeable about psychology. Even if they're doing A-level psychology, I'd always start with this little exercise, and it's a nice one to do with introductory psychology students in their first semester, term, or module. And I'm not sure how many introductory psychology tutors or teachers or staff we've got online today, but this, I think, is a really nice little exercise to do. So it's, how much of a psychologist are you? And I thought what we could do is, because I can't access the chat, Emma can monitor your responses, hopefully, to the next slide. So on the next slide, I've got a series of statements which are true or false. So this is what the attendees are presented with. And I go through each of these statements, asking the attendees whether they think the statement is true or whether it is false. So what I thought we might do is, rather than ask everybody, because I think there may be quite a few of you on here, is if in the chat box for each statement, if you put, excuse me, the letter T or F, and then at the end of the statements, Emma can let us know possibly how people responded. If there are lots of you, Emma's not going to be very happy with me because she's going to do a lot of monitoring, but we'll see how we go. Okay, so if we're all ready then, first statement, do you think this is true or false? A person with schizophrenia has a split personality. If you think it's true, put T in the chat. If you think it's F, put F. And Emma, if they're coming through as well.
They are coming through. So at the moment, I'm seeing a lot of Fs. So the general consensus is false.
Okay, no clues from me yet. Okay. Great stuff. Okay, the next one. Women are more likely to conform than are men.
Slightly more mixed on this one. Some trues, some falses, some question marks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. People who threaten to commit suicide rarely do. So T or F?
So again, slightly mixed, some true, some false, some variation.
Okay, great stuff. Next one. We only use 10% of our brain. True
I would
or false?
say mostly false, but a couple of question marks.
Okay. You can use a question mark as well, by the way. If you're unsure, just put a question mark.
Yes, absolutely. Any answer.
Yeah, any answer. Yes, unless the answer is a sandwich, because obviously somebody's asking about their lunch. Okay, next one. Astrology is a good predictor of personality. Do you think that's true or false?
Straight in with the falses. Many falses, all of the falses. Strong opinions on this one.
Typical Aquarians. Neuroscience has, oh, sorry, I missed one. Opposites attract in romantic relationships. Do you think that is true or false?
Generally false. A couple of trues, depends. Yeah, not quite as straightforward, I think.
Okay. Neuroscience has concluded that people are left-brained or right-brained. True or false?
Generally false, a couple of question marks.
Yeah, okay, great stuff. Thank you. People exposed to words about old people leave a laboratory walking more like an old person. True or false?
I think true has it this time. A couple of each, but generally true.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think that's possibly the most specific statement on that list. Okay. I mean, that is an interesting one. We'll come back to that in a second. People who suffer from amnesia typically cannot recall their own name or identity. True or false?
We're saying generally false on this one.
False. Great stuff. Yeah, any more? I see the numbers are going up as well. Okay. Right, lovely, thank you, folks. Penultimate one, human memory works like a video camera, accurately recording events.
So again, nice quick answers on this one, saying false.
Great stuff. You can sort of tell the majority of people on here are introductory psychology teachers. At least you hope they are. Okay, last one then. Once you have experienced an event and formed a memory of it, that memory does not change. True or false?
Again, some very quick answers here. So far, false is coming out on top.
Okay. Excellent. Any true ones, Emma, for that one, as far as you can see?
Nope, lots of falses.
Lots of falses. Okay. Great stuff. Well, listen, thank you very much for that. So shall we see how you did? Okay, so the correct answers then are coming up. Elishevert, have you got a drum for the drum roll? Okay, Elishevert's forgotten the drum today. Here we go. Well, they're all false. And what's interesting about them is that if we go back for a second, there's sort of statements that seem superficially true, and some of them are sort of common sense statements that people think are true, because in studies that have been conducted where you ask the general population some of these statements, they tend to agree with them. In a study we did back in 1996, asked participants questions like, does a person with schizophrenia have, and then gave them a list of options including split personality. A lot of people indicated they thought schizophrenia was a disorder characterized by split personality. And of course it isn't. It's dissociative thinking. It's not dissociative disorder, which is what split personality is. We only use 10% of our brain. Well, let me just go on a couple of slides. There was a film out, you probably know, a few years ago called Lucy, where the tagline was, this is 10% of their brain capacity. Today she will hit 100%. Of course, it's a complete myth, because we all use sort of 100% of our brain at different times of the day. And actually a very interesting intro psych exercise for students would be to actually find the source of that myth, because it's one of these fairly stubborn, unexpungible myths in psychology, even though psychologists know it's not true. Finding the actual source of that myth is quite hard, but it is possible. And it's a nice exercise maybe to do with students. Now, the specific item that I mentioned, which is, people exposed to words about old people leave a laboratory walking more like an old person, you might know is based on a study by Barg back in 1996, I think it was, where they found exactly this. So participants were presented with sentences that featured words related to old people, and they found that those participants walked out of the lab using the gait and the speed of an old person more than did people who just read sentences with no references to old people. And that was a very, at the time, very important finding and very significant one, because it seemed to suggest that even very simple thematic words can prime a person's behavior. So it was an example of social and sort of lexical priming, but social priming principally. The problem with that, of course, is that every replication has failed. There have been at least 2 replications of that study, replication attempts, and both of them have failed. And then the last 3 were about memory, and I think everybody more or less, from what Emma was saying, got the correct answers to those, because these are some other myths about memory that people do hold, and they're quite common myths when you ask people who aren't psychologists to indicate whether they agree or disagree with these statements. And of course, none of these are true. And we'll come on to an exercise you can give students about this in a sec. So that was Lucy. So what I thought is to very briefly touch on 2 or 3 areas in psychology, maybe 3 or 4 actually, looking at the list, of topics that I think psychology students will be very interested in knowing about, while at the same time teaching them about how psychologists do the research that they do. And I think one of the most significant developments over the last 10 years has been this idea of replicability, the ability that some studies in psychology, even very famous ones that appear in monolithic textbooks like Martin Carlson in the old days, would feature as being facts, as being orthodox information in the discipline. And of course, now we're beginning to learn that some of those studies may not actually be true. It's not that the results were inaccurate, it's just that the finding can't be replicated. So what I've tried to do in the 7th edition of psychology is to put in a lot more about the replicability of science and of psychology in particular. I remember when I joined Regents, I had a conversation with Dina at the time, and I just joined, and she said, "Oh, Neil, have you seen the report in The Guardian?" And I had. And it was about, I think it was the first Many Labs project where they failed to replicate a substantial number of psychology studies. And she was rather concerned, you know, because I was head of psychology at the time. And I think reading between the lines, she was slightly concerned that we were teaching completely bogus material. And I remember saying to her, actually, this is a good thing because it shows that psychology is getting its house in order. And where psychology leads, other disciplines tend to follow. And as I say, this is about 10 years ago now, and the field since then has developed considerably in terms of its integrity and also removing some questionable practices, but not all of them. We'll come to those in a second. So I thought I'd have a look at some of these topics in particular: replication, questionable research practices, deception, because you know everybody loves deception. Everybody thinks they know what is a clue to deception, even though those clues may not be correct. Face recognition, and then the knowledge of memory I mentioned, and then finish off with smell and taste, and a little bit about cognitive psychology and classroom teaching, but not too much. And then at the end, I'll tell you a little about the 7th edition of psychology, if you like, or you can break off for lunch. The information will still be on the slides. And any questions you have as well, Emma's monitoring the chat, so just send them through and I'll do my best to answer. So replication then, and replicability. Well, this, I think it is fair to say, is pretty dominant theme in science generally, certainly in our discipline, psychology. In 2021 in the UK Parliament actually had a special committee devoted to the topic of replicability in science generally, medical and social science. And back in 2018, when we published the 6th edition, this was the sum content of replication in that edition. It wasn't even a proper section in the book. It was like one of the boxed off sections, which is, as you can see, controversies in psychological science, because at the time it was controversial. And it reported the many labs and some failed replications. You can see there in the middle. So 3 pages, basically. You can see that man on the left there, his hairstyle hasn't improved at all since 2018. So if we fast forward to the 7th edition, in 2023, you can see there's a lot more replication in the new textbook, at least 10 pages, including, you can see at the bottom there, an interview with Brian Nosek, who set up the Open Science Framework and many labs and so on, to illustrate the importance of this topic to our discipline. And throughout the book, I've tried to bring in this notion of replication and replicability as the book progresses, and to make students think about what they're reading. I mean, the best advice I was ever given by one of my tutors, it was actually Robert Logie, who was at Aberdeen at the time, who's just retired now from Edinburgh. I remember him saying to me in a tutorial, question everything, which does make you a bit of a pain as a student, but he was right. So the idea behind the book is to get students to question what they read, even my textbook. And then back in 2017, with Richard Clark, we actually did a study of whether psychology journals, all of them, actually accepted replications. Because part of the problem with psychological research is that journals do not accept replications because they want to publish original work. So we wanted to see whether there was any evidence for this, empirical evidence. And in fact, there was. Of the 500 odd journals that we looked at, only 3% explicitly stated that they accepted replicated studies. That was about 30 of the journals. So we're doing a follow-up study now, and things have changed since 2017, thankfully, where journals are now accepting even registered reports. We'll come onto those in a sec. So in terms of converting this into a class activity, I thought, well, there are a few things you could do. Now, there's some fairly basic stuff, such as what's on the slide here, which is asking students about what they think a replication is, why it's important, not just in psychology, but in science generally. Ask them if they know what the Open Science Framework is, what many labs are. and also whether they know the difference between a direct and a conceptual replication, and what the differences are between those two. So that sort of sets the groundwork for maybe some more practical exercises like this one. So this is based on this very famous scuba diving context-dependent memory, context reinstatement memory study from 1975. And the beauty of this study is that it is invariably mentioned in the first year in a cognitive psychology or a memory class, because it's a classic study of its kind. And as I'm sure you know, so I don't have to go through it in too much detail, what Godden and Badley found was that scuba divers were able to better recall when the encoding and the recall of verbal material was the same. So if they encoded underwater, they recalled better underwater. Now, there was an attempt at a replication back in 2021, and then a follow-up reanalysis in 2022 by Muir. And an interesting exercise here is to get the students to compare these two studies. The unfortunate issue with the Muir study is that it's not a direct replication, but also it's not much of a conceptual replication either. There are some significant methodological problems and differences in the Muir study compared to the Godden and Badley study. So a good exercise might be to get the students to compare these two and ask them the questions that I've put at the bottom there. And also, what are the issues with describing the Muir study as a replication? If you've actually, has anybody read the Muir replication of this? Is anybody familiar with it? Just curious to know. If you have, just put yes in the chat. Or no, if you haven't.
No, it's not seeming familiar, I think.
Oh, interesting. Okay. It's worth having a look at, especially if you teach cognitive psychology, but sadly not for the right reasons. And then another activity you could do, which is tied to a very famous finding that we all know, but it's also tied to replication as well, is this, which is Strack's very famous 1988 study about facial feedback. And as you probably know, in the study, what Strack found that if you held your pen this way, so your face is adopting a positive physiognomy, then people judge cartoons to be funnier than if they held the pen this way. That's going to make an excellent screenshot for somebody, by the way. There you go. So the reasoning behind that was that the participants were receiving feedback from their face, and that feedback, that affective response, then fed into the cognitive response, which is the judgment of the cartoons. And you can see some of those images there from my lovely models from the 7th edition. And this you can get students to do themselves. So you can get a sort of series of cartoons, which you can easily get on the internet, and then do this in class. Because all you need is a pen, frankly. So these exercises don't rely on specialist equipment at all, and they're a very cheap way of exploring new and controversial research in psychology. So the actual study, the Strack study, is at the top there. That's the link, if you need the link. And it's easily replicable in a lecture theatre or in a tutorial or in a seminar. But, and you can see there's a theme developing, there have been 17 failed replications of this fairly significant study in psychology, very famous. But, and there's another but, the replication failure depends on, not necessarily on the effect, that is, the effect may exist, but it depends on how you manipulate the methodological features of your study. So again, the last link there shows that if you adopt a sort of slightly different version to Strack, or if you do Strack's study explicitly, then you find the same effect. And of course, what that leads you into thinking is, well, why? Is the way in which psychologists present their material, word their material, decide on the materials that they choose, could that influence the response? So you may not be seeing a genuine phenomenon, but a phenomenon that is specific to specific stimuli or to specific wording. So this is quite a nice little exercise to do, I think, and easy to do. Related to that are questionable research practices. There's a lot of work now on this. And yesterday I was reading, there was a study has just been published that has found that questionable research practices are still very common in Sweden. I'm not singling Sweden out, by the way. So, you know, if you're from Malmo, nothing against Malmo, Malmo's lovely, but these are still more common than people think they are, and they are quite common in psychology. I mean, studies have found that people do admit to committing at least one questionable research practice. And I've got a list of them on the next slide. So a way in which you can introduce this, because this is important to the integrity of research, is to ask students what they would consider to be a questionable research practice. You know, what makes a very bad, unethical study. And you could bring in, I've introduced a few names there, some of the well-known cases of fraud in psychology, and some of the more recent controversies that are still live at the moment to do with honesty research. And there's a link at the bottom, which is has just been published. It's published, I think, in the last week or so, which looks at one of these honesty studies in a lot more detail, as if it's an episode of Columbo. So it's a statistical approach to the study that was reported using the original data on which the study claimed to be based. And it's well worth seeking out. So do have a look at it if you get the chance. So one activity you could do that's quite straightforward is to have a list of these QRPs, and then you can ask students to match them with the definition, which is quite straightforward. But it also gets students talking about some relatively, I imagine to them in the first year, unfamiliar topics, such as p-hacking or hawking, you know, words that are familiar maybe to psychologists, but maybe not to students. Publication bias and what that means. There's a lot of publication bias historically in psychology, whereby, you know, positive results are published, negative results are less likely to be published. And again, this is one of these text-heavy slides I said I wasn't going to go through, but there are a few more ideas on that slide that you know, might be of interest if you're teaching this type of material, including, see the second question there, registered reports. And what do registered reports mean, and why are they useful to psychologists? You may even use them as part of your course. I know at one point we did consider adopting this at my previous institution, but it was impractical for final year students, because if a final year student would say we aim to collect within a certain frame of time, and they didn't manage to collect that sample in that frame of time, then you've sort of violated one of your, you know, pre-registered conditions of your study. So it doesn't work as well for students, but knowing about it though is important. And then just to finish off with QRPs, this is a very good study by Krishna and Peter, where they asked students to respond on a 5-point scale whether they thought behaving in the way on the left was acceptable or not acceptable. And the ways of behaving on the left are QRPs. So you've got things like selectively reporting studies, falsifying data, rounding off p-values, and so on. So what you can get them to do is to present them with these statements and ask them, you know, how acceptable do they find each of these activities? And then you could, as a supplementary, ask them whether their tutor or their supervisor would think the same thing. So you can ask them to estimate how their supervisor would respond. And then you can sort of compare and contrast. And also see which of those QRP students think are less likely to be considered questionable and which are more. And then you can compare it with the results of the original study. And the results of the original study are in the textbook, and they're in the paper as well, of course. So that was replication. The other topic I think is really interesting for intra-psych students is deception, because many people think they know when somebody is lying to them, but they don't quite know why, or they think they know why because they look for certain tells. They may think, well, averting eye gaze, or maybe talking a lot or gesticulating is an indicator of lying. So this is a really very simple exercise you can do with them, and that is you can present students with a list of the most common vocal and visual tells that people are most common lying. So you can see there are things like, hesitations, high-pitched voice, gaze aversion, facial fidgeting, illustrators, leg and foot movements, and so on and so on. And you can ask the group, well, which of those do you think is indicative of lying? And you can ask them yes or no, or don't know. And you can then compare their responses with the actual data. So these are the results of systematic reviews of the deception literature. And you can see of the cues that you just saw, only 3 of them are reliably associated with actual lying. So the assumed relationship is there on the right-hand side. So most people think that those features are characteristic of lying, and they're not. It's only high-pitched voice, fidgeting, and those illustrators, arm and hand movements designed to supplement what a person is saying. Those are reliably associated with lying. And so this gets students thinking about the importance of empirical research other than experience and anecdote, and maybe ask, why do they believe these things? What evidence do they have? And have they made sure that they're not committing confirmation bias when they believe that these cues are significant predictors of lying when they're not? So it's a very good way of promoting discussion about deception and what people know generally. And then another nice little one, this time in cognitive psychology, an exercise you can do on face recognition is this. And actually, I know I've been talking for a while, so listen, I'll hand over to you very briefly for a moment. And that is, you can see the image on screen. You've got lots of gentlemen's faces. In the chat, would you like to guess how many different faces you can see? So I'll give you a moment to just process the slide for a second, and then if in the chat, and Emma will keep an eye on this, let's see what numbers you come up with. So how many different faces can you see?
Oh, we've got someone who has seen this before, so thank you for spoilers to a minimum.
Yes, no spoilers, please.
No spoilers, no spoilers.
If you know the Jenkins et al. Study, then yeah, well, you know.
So yeah, there's 40 images in total, if that gives anyone any help.
So it takes a while to scan this one because, there are lots of faces.
Yeah, it's quite tricky.
So are we getting any numbers through, Emma, or nothing so far?
Got one, but not too many yet. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes and then see if there's any other guesses. We've got a bit of a range.
Oh, okay.
Got everything ranging from 1 or 2 to 3 or 4. See if anyone else has got any guesses.
And if you know the study as well, could you reply yes in the chat for me, so we get an idea of how familiar the study is? Because it's interesting, this is one I included in the 7th edition, but hadn't in the previous editions. And I sort of kicked myself really, because it's a really nice illustrator of what we're talking about.
Okay, so we have answers ranging from 1 or 2 up to 3, 4, 5.
Okay.
And then maybe even 10. So I think it depends. I think my answer was even higher than that. I thought it was almost 50-50.
And yeah, Emma saw lots of different faces, didn't you, Emma?
Yes, I saw many men's faces.
Yeah. So, and that is the purpose of this little experiment, really, because it looks as if there are many faces on the slide, but of course there are only 2 men. They're just different photographs of the same 2 men, but it looks as if they are very different. And it's a little exercise really to determine how good we are at recognizing faces. Most of us actually are pretty moderately good at recognizing faces, especially familiar faces, not necessarily unfamiliar ones. Super recognizers, of course, are very good, and people trained to recognize faces tend to do much better than the general population. So this is a very good way of introducing, what is it about a face that we recognize? So how do we identify faces, and also whether facial recognition technology can work. And there's a lot of research now to suggest that, you know, facial recognition technology is quite poor at recognizing faces accurately, but it is becoming more and more commonly used in sort of in criminal justice and protection from crime and so on. Well, the question is, well, does it work? And should it work? Is it ethical, which is a separate question to the cognitive one. So that's a very nice little exercise, I think. How many had read the study, Emma? Do we know, did anybody answer that question?
So at least one person, I'm not sure for anyone else. No, a couple of no's.
So a complimentary copy of the 7th edition goes to that person.
There we go, absolutely.
Yeah, Emma's not very happy with me now.
No, as I say, the more the merrier. So we'd love everyone to have a copy.
So again, those are some of the questions you could, you know, sort of, again, another one of these text-heavy slides, but again, shows you some of the simple exercises you can do on face recognition to get students to explore the idea of recognizing faces and what we look at in faces when we do recognize them. I mean, the first one, I'll just mention the first bullet point. You know, you can present students with images of facial features where those have been cut out of very famous people's images in magazines, and ask them to identify those famous people from those features, whether it's the eyes, you know, the mouth, the nose, and so on. The eyes tend to be the best predictor of face recognition accuracy, obviously, but it's an interesting way of maybe having students explore what features they do look at when they look at somebody's face and recognize it as somebody that they know. And then just to touch very finally and briefly on memory, casting our minds back to the third slide about myths about memory. What you have here is, if you ignore the numbers for the time being, on the left-hand side, you've got some of the well-known myths about psychology, including a couple we looked at earlier. So amnesia, people suffering from amnesia typically cannot recall their own name and identity. And then the video memory one, human memory works like a video camera, actively recording the events, and so on and so on. And you can see from the responses, if you look at the numbers now, so there was a study conducted in 2001 which looked at MTurk responses and also responses to a telephone survey from memory, I think it was. And you can see that a lot of people believe those myths, I call them myths of untruths or inaccurate statements. Let's put it a different way, inaccurate statements. Because of course, one of the things that people with amnesia do remember is their name. And one of the key features of malingering is that malingerers think that amnesiacs cannot remember their name. And of course, this is one of the things they can. There are other things they can't. And if you've read the first book I ever wrote, it was for Pearson, funny enough, Human Neuropsychology, there is a list of those features that are genuinely predictive of amnesia and also malingering in there, if you're interested. And even the video camera one, I mean, about half of the survey thought that was true. And then on the right-hand side, this was a different study by Bruin et al. From 2019. And they asked people to agree or disagree whether these terms here were metaphors that accurately reflected memory. So you've got the typical things, maybe like diary entry, video camera, and library. And then if you go right down to the bottom, we have bottle, compost heap, and aviary. And if you've ever used compost heap as a metaphor for memory, maybe you didn't have a good night the night before the lecture, I don't know. But it was interesting though. I mean, even sort of 3.6 is just below the mean response to that. So somebody thought that was a reasonably convincing metaphor to describe memory. Anyway, the top three were diary entry, video camera, and library. They were bumping towards the strongly agree end of that scale. And of course, we know that that is not true. Memory does not work like a video camera. So why do people hold these beliefs that are not true about memory? Well, and again, we come back to replication. It seems the wording is very important when you ask people these questions. So when participants were presented with this statement about memory being like a video camera, they were less likely to accept the video camera metaphor. So again, the way in which psychologists word these statements can affect the results that they obtain at the end of the study. And again, that's an interesting segue into, you know, the methodological issues in psychological research, because we often accept, well, I say often accept, we sometimes accept what we see in papers as being, well, we accept it at face value. We accept the validity at face value. But sometimes if you sort of focus more into the types of wording that was used in these studies, you can often be a little bit suspect about, you know, the wording that's used, and whether the wording was the right wording used, whether it was misleading in some way, or leading in some way, or set up, you know, expectancy effects in participants. And then lastly, I thought, oh, well, I'd end up with, you need a, but the prop is quite easy to get hold of. And these sort of exercises are really fun to do if you're doing, say, a biological psychology or a sensation and perception seminar, class, or tutorial, or lab, or even lab exercise. And one of my main research areas is smell and taste, chemoreception. So when I do presentations about smell, and when I do seminars, I do 3 presentations at least. There's one where I use a pheromone, which I haven't got with me, but maybe I can go and get it if you've got a break, called Boar Mate. Pheromones are fascinating because 50% of the human population can't smell it. Half the people who can thinks it smells like a gent's lavatory. So if you're spraying yourself with pheromone, you know, gentlemen, and it's usually gentlemen in these studies, half the population isn't going to be able to smell you, and half that can are going to think you smell like a toilet. So you invest in other more fragrant products is the message there. So I do this one in class. It is the pheromone Boar Mate is used by vets to get sows to adopt the position of lordosis so that she can be artificially inseminated. And in the mammalian kingdom, the non-human mammalian kingdom, pheromones are relatively common. We do produce the pheromone that is in this can. It's called androstenone, but it is the most famous anosmia. It's the most significant anosmia, not famous, the most significant anosmia in humans. So most of us can't smell it, and it's genetic. If you've got the gene to detect androstenone, you'll detect it. Whether your affective response differs is, it's not known why people dislike it or are indifferent to it if they can smell it. But it's a really interesting exercise to do in class, because again, it highlights this notion of, can we really believe our own senses, or should we assume that others can sense what we do? Because if you can't smell this chemical and others can, you know, does that chemical exist? Well, if you can't smell it, you know, in one sense it doesn't. The issue with androstenone and Boar Mate is you have to get it from specialist suppliers. So it's a bit tricky to get hold of, but if you can, it's a brilliant exercise. I can't smell it, which is why when I have to prepare this, I have to do it in a toilet. Because I did it once in the lab and somebody passed and said, "What is that awful smell?" So I learnt my lesson, and I prepared my materials in the appropriate setting, which was a toilet. The third one, before I get on to jelly beans, is miracle fruit. Miracle fruit is really cheap to buy, and you can buy it off the internet, but it's a great way of showing how the sense of taste works or doesn't. Because if you chew miracle fruit, the consequence of it is that very sour or bitter foods will begin to take on the flavor or the taste of sweetness. So if you bit onto a miracle fruit pill, so the pills come in like a blister pack. So if you put one of those into your mouth and sort of start chewing, and then have, say, a pint of Guinness or suck on a lemon, then the Guinness will taste like syrup. The lemon will taste like the sweetest lemon you've ever tried. And even sort of tasting other sour, bitter substances, the flavor will change completely, because the chemical in the pill alters the taste receptors, and it actually comes from a plant as well. So it's a natural product that's been manufactured as a pill. So you can buy those in little boxes, and you can get 12 per box, and a really good way of making students aware of how their taste can change. Which brings us to the jelly bean test, talking of taste changing. Because when we say have a cold or a flu, the most common response you tend to hear is that when people are having food, one, they think they've lost their appetite because the food has lost its taste. You know, we say, "Oh, I can't taste the food." The thing is, if you do have a virus, you can actually taste the food. You can tell whether it's sweet, salty, sour, and so on. You know, one of the 5 basic tastes. What's affected during a virus is your sense of smell. Your olfactory receptors aren't working. So what you should really say is, I can't smell this food, but we don't, because we think of food as being ingested and think of tasting it. And this is one way of demonstrating that without actually giving somebody a virus, because nobody wants to do that. So get a little packet of jelly beans, doesn't have to be a tub, could be like a tiny little box. And in the session, you can ask for volunteers and get your volunteer to close their eyes, get them to pinch their nose. It's often useful if you can do this just to make sure that there's no air at all going in or out of the nostrils. You can use like a swimmer's nose clip. That sometimes works, although I've tried doing that once and some air does get through. So you may have to sort of pinch the participant's nose. And then with the eyes closed and the nares pinched, pop one of the jelly beans into the person's mouth and ask them to chew. And then once they've chewed for a bit, ask them, what can you detect? What flavor? Now, if this has worked, and it tends to work most of the time, your participant will say, oh, it smells of, so it tastes sugary, or it tastes sour, something like that. What they won't be able to do is to identify the flavor. So whether it's orange or blackcurrant or cinnamon or whatever the jelly bean is. And then if you sort of release the nares, and they can open their eyes as well, then they will be able to identify that flavor, because the airflow will allow the olfactory receptors to work. So the odor molecules in the food will now be allowed to be processed by the olfactory receptors at the back of the throat and also at the top of the nose here. There are 2 pathways to breathing, orthonasal and retronasal. The retronasal pathway is the one involved when we're ingesting food, rather than sniffing things like, you know, perfume or the air. And again, it's a very good exercise to illustrate, I suppose, 2 things. One, language that we use in psychology. So here it's taste versus flavor versus smell, when about 80% of food flavor is olfactory. Taste is important, but so is olfaction. And also getting people to realize how the sense of smell actually works. And people are often very surprised when, you know, they do this exercise that this is the effect that you do find. So it's a very cheap, very fun way to sort of illustrate the human sense of smell. And the beauty of jelly beans is they have a map. So there are about 36, in this case, 36 flavors, but they give you a map with each jelly bean, the color and the name underneath. So you know what the person is smelling. If you can afford it as well, there is an identification test, smell identification test called sniffing sticks, which is a set of about 13, 14, they look like sort of white marker boards, and they've got a felt tip at the end. You take the tip off, and they're impregnated with an odor. And it's a way of testing people's ability, one, to smell, and secondly, to identify common sense. So if you can afford one of those, again, it's a very good exercise to do in class, because it highlights how poor we as humans tend to be in identifying smells. Our immediate response to smell is effective. We think it smells good, or it smells indifferent, or it smells really bad. What we're not as good at doing is labeling those smells accurately. We tend to apply descriptors like, oh, this smells like something, rather than saying, this is what it is. And even if you move beyond the descriptor, you still don't get to the actual name. So we might say something like, oh, that smells like freshly mown grass, which is what we know what that smell is. We don't say it's hexanol, which is what gives freshly mown grass its freshly mown grass scent, because ultimately it's chemistry interacting with psychology. So yeah, if you can get hold of one of those, it's a very useful little exercise to do in class to illustrate chemoreception. That's the jelly bean test in a bit more detail, by the way, so if you wanted the instructions, they're there. And lastly, in terms of introducing new things into the classroom, a sort of slightly different approach. And this is an approach that maybe we as instructors might find useful. Could I just ask, in the chat, could you let me know whether you're familiar with either of these papers, or whether you've come across them, or whether you've read them? Just put yes or no in chat for me, if you could, because it'd be nice to know who's familiar with these two and who isn't.
So far a couple of no's.
Okay.
So one yes to the one on the left, but so far no's, don't think so.
Okay.
So no, not a lot of.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And that's, yeah, that is interesting because they're not, I would say, especially well known, but I think they are two of the best papers written about applying psychology in the classroom. So classrooms like ours, when we teach students. So they're both sort of either authored or co-authored by Henry Rediger. The one on the left I find particularly useful. And what the review on the left has done is looked at most of the common learning techniques that people have used in order to enhance learning. And they've looked at the evidence as to whether those techniques work. So, you know, they go from like very basic stuff like mnemonics to things like underlining and highlighting. So, you know, we often say to students, well, you know, maybe highlight the text first, don't write from the article or the book onto the paper or onto your screen or whatever. Highlight what you think is important first. When you're revising, maybe underline or highlight the things that you think are important. Well, this paper looks at whether that works as a learning device. So it looks at a range of these, and cramming is another one. Does cramming work? Spoiler, doesn't. So it looks at all of these. And it's a brilliant paper because there are some very, very good ideas in there that we can adopt as instructors. The most successful learning technique that they reviewed, they found a lot of evidence for it, and it's one, sadly, that students tend to dislike the most, is regular testing. So what they found is that in studies where students were regularly tested, so they had like a test like once a week on the material they were covering, their performance at an end of term or mid-term exam was significantly better than students who weren't regularly tested. So this idea of maybe having, you know, a regular top-up revision session in the subsequent week is actually quite a good idea. Maybe having, you know, like a 10-item MCQ quick test at the beginning of each lecture. I mean, it assumes that, you know, the students will actively engage in the revision before they do this task, if the test is, you know, formative rather than summative, but the evidence is there. And I find when I talk to students about this, you know, invariably the response is, oh. But I think it's important to let them know that if they do test themselves regularly, they will be better informed students at the end of the course. In my biological psychology module, I don't make this mandatory, but I do give them a list of MCQs and true or false questions at the subsequent lecture based on what we covered in the previous lecture, and you know, ask them to revise ahead of class as well, just to get them into the spirit of regularly testing themselves. So if you haven't had a look at those two, do have a look. They're well worth having a look. And in the 7th edition, there is, I think it's a psychology in action section, where I look at the evidence from these papers and others, looking at the sort of techniques that students can apply themselves to make themselves better learners. There's some interesting research as well, by the way, it's a little tangent, but I've only just remembered this, about whether taking contemporaneous notes as a lecture is going on, for example, whether that impairs a student's learning. You know, there was an idea that if you had students just typing notes into a laptop, this makes them less able learners because they're more concerned with transcribing rather than understanding what's being said. One study, I think, claimed to find this. Some other research now seems to suggest that doesn't happen. and that people who take notes in class on a laptop are just as understand just as much as those who maybe process the information in a different way. Okay. So those are just some of the ideas then I thought it would be good to talk to you about today, and maybe you could incorporate in introductory psychology classes the instructor's manual that goes along with the textbook, and there is one inevitably, has about 300 of these types of exercises, so about 20 odd per chapter. So there are 17 chapters in the textbook. And you also get MCQs as well for each of the chapters. And I think, Emma, you'd be able to let me know for sure, but I think there are about 100 odd MCQs per chapter. So again, if you wanted to test students, weekly, there is a test bank available for you, I think, if you were an adopter of this book. And there are PowerPoint slides as well, summarizing some of the important text in the book. And then you can go and have a coffee now if you like, but I thought I'll just finish off just very briefly, largely because I'm very proud of this book, and I'm thrilled that people do use it, because one of the most exciting things I ever read as a student in my first year at the University of Aberdeen, intending to study English and media studies, found myself by accident doing psychology, and then graduating in psychology. The most exciting book I read, apart from Ulysses and Flann O'Brien, was my introductory psychology textbook. It was called Principles of Psychology by Price, Glickstein, Horton and Bailey. Still remember the names. And Bailey was brought in as a professional writer, interestingly. So the first three were psychologists, and Horton came in just to sort of do a polish on the writing to make sure it was readable, and it really worked. And that really enthused my motivation to carry on with psychology. So I've tried to bring some of that enthusiasm and excitement to, the book, especially in the 7th edition. So it's got 17 chapters. We've got 57 spotlights on, where I look at some new or unusual research in psychology. There are 26 controversies in psychological science sections. You saw the replication one from edition 6. So there are controversial topics that we look at. There are 39 psychology in action sections. So how has psychology been used in practice? And some of the new ones there are about vaccine acceptance. Does CCTV prevent bystander intervention? How do people behave in crowds when there's an emergency? Lots of interesting things like that. Does nudging work in a practical context? And then there are 36 international perspectives, where we look at, genuinely international perspectives on a topic. Again, one of the criticisms some people have had about our discipline is that it's very weird, very Western-centric. Often we don't report socioeconomic status, the cultural background of our participants, and we see our study through a particular cultural lens. I've reviewed, quite a few papers from a journal I was a consulting editor at, which, and through no fault of their own, the authors had a very country-specific approach to psychology. And of course, people outside that country would not understand what they were referring to when they refer to the type of term, when they refer to the type of teaching, when they refer to the way in which students are taught, because the way psychology is taught is not universal. But we think it is because, we teach it, that we think this must be the way it's taught. So there are those issues in psychology as well. So these sections are designed to sort of redress that balance a little bit. In fact, there was a paper, talking of which, there's a paper published this week that looked at whether developmental psychology journals publish socioeconomic status of participants, finding that, by and large, they don't. There's a lot of work on developmental psychology journals and what they do and don't include, interestingly enough, developmental and social psychology. And then, unique to the 7th edition this time around, I wanted to interview some interesting people that have made a significant contribution to psychology or who practice psychology. So I've interviewed a clinical psychologist, educational psychologist. Who else did we have? There was Was there a forensic psychologist? There may not have been. There was Matt Wall, who runs fMRI scans. So Matt's job is literally running brain scanning experiments. So we interviewed Matt. There were interviews with Elizabeth Bick, Brian Nosek, and Nick Brown. Susan Mishi, who was the member of the SAGE behavioural unit during COVID, who was advising the government at the time of COVID as part of the their committee. She agreed to do an interview as well. So there are lots of interesting interviews like this. There's an interview with the person who runs the training for the National Autistic Society, for example. So I wanted to get, you know, a flavour of what psychologists do in practice, but also what are their views of psychology. So I do ask them, you know, what do they think of the challenges in the discipline? How are we going to overcome those challenges if they can be? And most are quite positive about overcoming the challenges, but some are not. So it's interesting to get those sort of different perspectives. There are over 1,000 new references. I mean, a lot of reading goes into the 7th edition. Doesn't tend to please the editors because they always say, can you cut down on the text, please? And I pretend that I will. And then the book ends up being like 40 pages bigger than it should be. But I say, yeah, but it's important that students know this stuff. And it sort of is, really. And just to finish off with what else is new, there are some expanded sections of what I think are topical and psychologically relevant topics. So I haven't included these topics just because, you know, they're currently the flavour of the month in our experience, but they are psychologically meaningful in some way, such as vaccine acceptance, you know, who does not accept vaccines? What are the predictors of vaccine acceptance? Attitudes to climate change, fake news, how do you fight it? How do you process it? Who believes it? Who doesn't believe it? Nudging, I've mentioned. Conspiracy theories. Daniel Jolly is another person I've interviewed from Nottingham University. Daniel, you probably know, does a lot of work on the psychology of conspiracy theories and why people hold conspiracy theories. And then there are also sort of broader topics like the use of phonics to teach reading in children, based on the work by, you know, Kathy Rassel and Kate Nation and others and so on. So these sort of topics I've included, you know, just to keep the book fresh and up to date. But the topics also touch on psychological principles in an important way and in a significant way, I think. And of course, at the bottom there, inevitably, there's a lot of work included about our behavioural response during COVID and during lockdown as well, because while this book was being written, I think we were largely in lockdown. So those are some of the new things in the 7th edition. So all that remains for me to say is to just say thank you so much for listening and for being here today. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope we've given you some interesting ideas to think about. Some you probably knew about already. That I think is a given. But hopefully I've tried to introduce some ways of new controversial research into the introductory psychology program, and, you know, hopefully you find it useful. And everything I've said today will be on the presentation, and Emma will be more than happy to send you a copy of that presentation. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, by the way, just fire them through chat. And if you want to get in touch with me directly, neilonComedy@outlook.com is the best way. Or I'm on Twitter, not X, Twitter @NeilMartin if you want to sort of join in the fun over in that exciting venue of our times. So thank you very much. And also thank you as well to Emma and Elisabeth for arranging this talk today. It's been a pleasure and an honour. So thank you everybody for your patience and for taking up your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. That's been fantastic. Again, so I've certainly learned so much, and it's great to go back over some of the information, particularly around the book that we've launched. And say, I think your passion for the subject and the work that you've been doing really comes through loud and clear. So thank you for sharing your time with us. If anyone has any questions that they want to put into the chat, we can have a quick discussion now. I'm aware we've run over slightly, so thank you so much to those of you who've spent that bit of extra time with us today. and everything in the recording will be shared within the next week or so. So we will be sharing, again, the slides that Neil's been working from today, as well as the recording. So if anyone has any questions, please do just pop them in the chat and we can discuss those now. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming along, and we will be in touch. If anyone wants to get a copy of Neil's book, we can send that to you. And as I say, we'll be in touch very soon. So thank you very much. Lots of thank yous coming through, lots of praise. So yes, thank you so much, Neil. Really appreciated, really interesting.
Very kind, thank you. And if you have any feedback as well, if you have read the 6th or the 7th edition and you have any feedback, then please send it through, positive or negative. Proper psychology, I accept both praise and criticism. But
always keen to hear reviewer feedback.
If you think there's something is missing that you think should have been in there, make Emma's life really unhappy by extending the.
I was gonna say, always keen to hear if you want extra or if you want anything taken out, somewhere between the two. As Neil says, it's always that we want to have even more in there, and we have to try and find the space.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think in that case, we'll wrap everything up. If anyone has questions later, do let us know. And thanks again for a really successful webinar. That's been brilliant. Okay, thanks everyone.
Have a lovely afternoon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.